Hi, and welcome to our very final chapter of Boston Jane. Chapter 14, or Thinking and Sewing. Come to the beach, Boston Jane, Sudie said excitedly. Apparently a large whale had washed up the beach. The little girl tugged on my hand and smiled up at me. Sudie was much improved, and more often than not could be found at Mr. Russell's cabin, hanging on my skirts. She was a different child since her illness, quieter, and there was a lingering sadness about her. She asked often about Suisse, about where she'd gone, but when I explained that Suisse was in heaven, she looked confused. Heaven is for Boston Tillicum, she said, not Chinook. Suisse is with God in heaven with the angels, I said. God is for Boston Tillicum. Suisse is not with Boston God, she insisted. I shook my head. What are angels? Sudie demanded. Angels are people with wings. Sudie regarded me skeptically. Like owls? Father Joseph had survived his fever, but it was plain to see that he had done a very poor job converting the Indians, for they regarded most of what he told them as nonsense. In the end, Handsome Jim had taken the little girl aside and explained that Suisse was in her canoe and was now at the center of the earth where she was most happy. Suisse's Tamanoas is crane. When you hear crane, call hoo, he demonstrated. It is your mother come to visit you. Sudie seemed satisfied with this explanation. She remembered little of the horrible night her mother had died, and I was thankful to any god, Christian or Chinook, for that. I was quietly thankful for other things, too. Dolly had disappeared, run away in the days following Suisse's death. While I grieved for Suisse, I couldn't help but think that her death had given the young slave girl a new chance at life. Handsome Jim was another story. His case of the pox had been mild, and unlike many of the survivors, he had no scars, no visible scars at least. He had lost many close friends, and something in him had changed. He was not the carefree young man he had been. He insisted that everyone call him by his new name, Ker-Ukso. It meant crooked nose. I was very worried about him. Boston Jane, come to the beach. Whale is very good, Sudie persisted, interrupting my thoughts. Get Ker-Ukso, too. That's a fine idea, Sudie, I said. We found Handsome Jim outside Toke's lodge. He was the only one there. Everyone else was at the beach with the whale. He was furiously carving at a piece of wood that I knew was going to be a canoe. He seemed to be pouring all his rage and grief into it. Come to the beach, Sudie said, tugging his hand. He shook his head grimly. Yes, I said gently. Sudie wants you to come. You can't disappoint her. Sudie smiled impishly at him. Handsome Jim's face darkened, but he allowed himself to be bullied along to the beach. We smelled it before we saw it, a pungent, fishy smell carried on the warm, humid August breeze. The Indians had already begun to strip off the meat and blubber, and the rib cage of the great beast was visible. Everyone was doing the greasy butchering work. Scavenger birds cried and shrieked in anticipation of their meal. Brandywine barked happily and charged at the gulls, scaring them off. I was given a small knife to slice slabs of the meat, and in no time at all I was as greasy as everyone else. A young man I did not know saw me standing there in my Chinook skirt, slathered in grease and blood, and said something that made Handsome Jim raise an eyebrow. What? I demanded. Handsome Jim's expression was serious. He says you make good wife. He says he give you canoe if you be wife. Oh, really? Just one canoe? Handsome Jim sniffed me. But you smell like fish, not wife. And for the first time in weeks, the ghost of a smile flitted across his face. Fish, you say? I demanded in a mock-serious voice. I grabbed up a piece of blubber and threw it at him. It landed on his chest with a slimy slap, and Handsome Jim went still, a stunned expression on his face, and I froze, worried that I had gone too far. And then he roared in laughter. As a wave of relief washed over me, I remembered Sally Biddle and the ill-fated apple all those years ago. At least my aim had improved. And that was where I was, standing in the ribcage of the whale, when a party of men approached from down the beach. I squinted in the setting sun, the light bouncing off the glistening bay like sparks, and I could make out Mr. Swan, Mr. Russell, Chief Toke, and farther in the distance, two other figures, one most definitely an Indian. Mr. Swan, I called happily. Mr. Swan waved enthusiastically. It was good to see his jolly face. Good heavens, girl, you're in the belly of the beast now, he laughed as the group drew near. I wiped a blob of grease off my face. I dare say you had a boring time then, without Mr. Russell and me around to liven things up, Mr. Swan asked. I don't know about that. Didn't recognize you, gal. Mr. Russell spat a wad of tobacco. It landed naturally next to my bare foot. It's a pleasure to see you too again, Mr. Russell, I said with a sigh. He snorted. Mr. Swan passed me a sack. I think you'll find these handy. Inside was a pair of men's boots. He shrugged. It seems that ladies' shoes are not a popular item in these parts. Those are for a boy, but I think they will fit. I looked down at my bare feet and wiggled my toes. You seem well enough, my dear, Mr. Swan said seriously. I hear you are a great medicine woman now. Suisse died, I said softly, watching as Chief Toke caught up little Sooty in his arms and hugged her tight. Mr. Swan looked grave. I know. One of Toke's nephews found us and related the sad news. I'm afraid the old boy is quite devastated. She will be very much missed. Yes, I whispered. I'm sorry we were so long away. You see, we were waiting for someone. Suddenly, he was all smiles, and he waved a man forward. Yella. The young man grinned at me, his nose ring blinking in the sun. Before I could say anything, a figure stepped out from behind Yella. I gasped. I looked considerably different from the last time he'd seen me. I was wearing my Chinook skirt, my legs were bare for all the world to see, and I was slathered from top to tail in whale blood and guts. Even my red curls were smeared with grease. It's fair to say that Miss Hepplewhite would not have approved. William, I whispered. I'm so happy to see you, I said, hardly believing he was standing there. His blonde hair shone like golden wheat in the sunlight, but he seemed, well, smaller than I remembered. Jehu would tower over him. And I you, he said somewhat stiffly, looking me up and down. I hastily tugged down the hem of my skirt where it stuck to my bare legs. My dresses were all eaten by Burton. He looked at me blankly. Mr. Russell's cow, I explained quickly. I didn't know what to say about the whale guts. It seemed best to say nothing, judging from the expression on his face. I see, he said. We stood there awkwardly. I was aware of the other men watching us with unabashed curiosity. Shall we go speak somewhere? Private? I held out my arm. After a moment that seemed to stretch out forever, he took it and led me down the beach away from the others. I hardly knew how to feel. I dreamed of this moment for months, dreamed of a joyful, romantic reunion, of being swept into his arms. But now that he was here, part of me wanted to shout at him. The endless months of frustration poured out in a rush. William, what happened? Why didn't you wait for me? Our departure was delayed, and I sent a letter, and I know you never received it, but still... He pulled a crumpled letter out of his pocket. I recognized it at once. It was the letter I'd written him saying I'd been delayed. I looked at him expectantly. William shook his head. I just picked it up over in Astoria a few days ago. He looked out at the sparkling bay, the gulls crying and swooping low in the water. I waited for you, Jane, but when you didn't arrive as scheduled, I thought you'd changed your mind. I swallowed hard. It seemed a sensible explanation. But what is this about your negotiating a treaty with the Indians? William, what happened to your dreams of a timber business? What? My, you've become outspoken, he said, a gentle rebuke. I swallowed hard, remembering my very first lesson at Miss Hepplewhite's, Listening Well, Chapter 5. After a moment, he cleared his throat and smiled at me formally. But I am glad you didn't change your mind after all. It is good to see you. I started to smile back. But, he continued, frowning, this oyster venture of yours and Mr. Swan's. I nodded. Now that I am here, of course, I shall assume responsibility of it. Such matters aren't proper for a respectable young wife to manage on her own, don't you agree? You have more important things with which to concern yourself. He looked pointedly at my Chinook skirt. A new wardrobe, for instance? Papa's voice suddenly thundered in my ear. Janie, you're not going to turn into one of those useless women who care for nothing but dresses. I looked at William and swallowed hard. Then it's settled, William said, as if the discussion were over. Now, regarding our nuptials... The water lapped gently against the shoreline, and I had the strangest sensation of being watched. I looked around, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I believe it is best if we are wed at the end of the week, William said in a decisive voice. It wasn't my imagination. Down the beach in the bramble bushes was an Indian girl, and she was watching us. A pretty young girl, shapely as a doe, with the skin the color of cream. She saw me catch sight of her and ducked back behind the bush. Did you see that girl? I asked. What girl? The one in the bushes. There's no one there, he said. Now, about the wedding. All at once I remembered. I have no wedding dress. Mr. Swan brought back some fabric from Astoria. I'm sure you can make something up in time. I seem to recall that you are very skilled with a needle. Yes, I said, I am. I looked at the hands resting in my lap. They were hands that had carved oysters, harvested oysters, shot at a cougar, dug graves, ministered to the sick, and butchered a whale. Could these same hands sew a wedding dress? Would they remember? We'll marry in 1 week, William said in a firm voice. 1 week felt very near, and my stomach fluttered nervously. Was it fluttering in anticipation or something else? But wasn't this what I had wanted? Sally Biddle's mocking face danced before my eyes, and I forced myself to smile sweetly at William. "It's decided then," William said in a smug voice, leaning over. "A kiss from my future wife?" His nose loomed large before me, and for no reason I could fathom, I thought of Jehu's bright blue eyes. I pulled away with a jerk. No, thank you. We're not married yet." His eyes narrowed slightly. "As you wish, Jane." So is that the reunion that you were picturing? I know for me, I pictured like them romantically, like, "Oh, I missed you." And instead, it's like, who's changed? He's still like, "You should be quiet. I do what I say. This is what's happening. You can't have a business." And she's acting kind of weird about that now. So what do you think? In the days following William's arrival, it seemed as if the strange Indian girl shadowed us everywhere we went. "She is not Chinook," Handsome Jim said. "Maka, she is." I was convinced the mysterious Maka girl was somehow connected with William. I wanted to ask Yella about her, but he had disappeared. Handsome Jim also took to shadowing William. My friend didn't care for William and did not hesitate to let me know. "Boston William, he no good," he insisted, shaking his head. "He'll make a very fine husband," I said. "He's smart and handsome and—" My friend put his hand to his chest. "He have weak Tomanoas." I sighed. Handsome Jim said firmly, "Tomanoas probably small mouse." He considered a moment. "Or flea." "He doesn't have a Tomanoas. He's not Chinook," I said, exasperated. Handsome Jim regarded me, a grave expression on his face. "You have Tomanoas, Boston Jane." "If I have a Tomanoas, what is it?" "Wolf." "Wolf? That's not very good." "Wolf is good Tomanoas," he countered. "Why?" Handsome Jim regarded me with keen eyes. "Most loyal." In honor of William's presence, I prepared a pie for supper. Salmon berries were no longer in season, so I used huckleberries. "Delicious," William declared. "Better than Mrs. Parker's cherry pie." I blushed with pride. After supper, I sat in a corner and set to work on my wedding dress. Mr. Swan had brought back a bolt of blue fabric from Astoria. It was quite lovely, and I hoped William would not be disappointed that it wasn't green. In any event, the blue was quite becoming. The men sat around smoking pipes and discussing the Indian treaty. It seemed that William was very involved in negotiating all over the territory. When I'd asked him earlier in the day why he was involved, he'd been rather evasive. "Governor Stevens has been an invaluable source of counsel to me. I could not very well turn down his request," he said. "And it's a great honor, isn't it, Jane?" "I suppose," I said, "but what about your plans to make your fortune in timber?" "Jane, when would I have had time to start a business?" he asked irritably. "I have timber on my land. It will still be there when the negotiations are complete, and we must clear it when you and I begin work on the house." "You mean you haven't even—" I was so upset I stumbled over my words. "Jane," he cut me off coldly, "enough questions." Now, as I sat and sewed, I tried to untangle my feelings. I was very confused by William. Papa's words seemed to echo in my ears. "There are plenty of eligible young bachelors right here in Philadelphia. There's no call to follow one out west, especially one with no sense." William's voice was getting louder. I looked up from my sewing. "The point is that the area is crawling with Indians on land that has been designated for homesteading. That is why the main provision of the treaty is to get all the tribes on a reservation," William said. "Dang fool idea if I ever heard one," Mr. Russell said skeptically, shaking his head. "Mr. Russell's right," Mr. Swan said. "Chief Toke will not be amenable to those terms." "It is the policy. Putting the Indians on reservations is the only solution to the Indian problem," William said firmly. "Indian problem?" Mr. Russell hooted and spat. "We couldn't manage without 'em." "William," Mr. Swan said with a sigh, "there is no reason to round up the Indians. They're perfectly fine where they are. You know very well that we haven't had any problems with them. Why, you yourself have spent time in Toke's Lodge." "Mr. Swan," William said abruptly, "I was naive. I have traveled these last few months throughout the whole territory, and my eyes have been opened to the true state of affairs. You cannot trust these Indians. You have been lulled into a false sense of security by your isolation. Believe me, these Indians are unpredictable. Think of the Whitman Party. Those missionaries were killed by Cayuse, not Chinook," Mr. Swan countered. "I've met men who were there. Women and children were slaughtered," William said coldly. Mr. Swan sighed heavily. "That was many years ago, dear boy, and I dare say that there is more to that sad story than we shall ever know." He swiveled in his chair and looked at me for support. "Nonetheless, my dear, will you please tell your betrothed that he has the most incorrect notions about our Indians?" The silence in the small cabin roared in my ears. I looked at the bunks where I had nursed Handsome Jim and Suisse and Sudie and the others. William, Mr. Swan is correct. Chief Toke's people are our neighbors and dear friends. Why, Handsome Jim... This is no matter of concern to a lady, William interrupted in a stiff voice. Mr. Russell chortled, She ain't no lady. Our gal here has a mind of her own. My face went hot. I didn't know which was worse, being told to shut up or being told I wasn't a lady. I ran out of the cabin, humiliation coursing through my veins. What do you think about how William is treating her? Different than he did? Like, what's going on? The next morning found me sitting on a log on the beach, sewing the hem of my wedding dress with angry fingers. I had to rip out the stitches 3 times before I got them right. I had spent a restless night in Chief Toke's lodge, bundled next to Sooty, and couldn't sew straight for Mr. Russell's words ringing in my ears. She ain't no lady. Was Mr. Russell right? Was I no longer a lady? And was that what was really bothering me? Or was it something else, something that had to do with the way William kept dismissing me, as if my opinion were of no account? I thought and thought as my fingers stitched, trying to make sense of the muddle. Miss Hepplewhite's voice nagged at me. Girls, you must strive always to please others and do so cheerfully, for this is where your true happiness lies. Did my happiness lie in pleasing William and being the wife he wanted? Suddenly, Papa's voice spoke loudly in my ear. Speak up, Janie. Say what's on your mind. So you can see the 2 influences in her past. Her father, speak up, think for yourself. And Miss Hepplewhite, be a woman, be proper, keep your mouth shut, do what you're told. So now she's conflicted. Which will she choose? There you are, William said, sitting down next to me on the log and sighing heavily. I didn't look up. I'm terribly sorry if I upset you, he said, a contrite expression on his face. Miss Hepplewhite always said that a lady should be gracious about accepting apologies. Apology accepted, I murmured, although perhaps not in the most gracious manner. He smiled broadly. I knew you were a sensible thing. Perhaps we should discuss our wedding ceremony. Certainly, I said, forcing a bright smile. Sensible thing? Now, Jane, I was thinking that Father Joseph... But I wasn't listening to a word he said, for standing by the bushes in plain view was the Maka girl. She stood there as if she meant to be seen, and when my eyes met hers, they returned my stare challengingly. That girl's been following us all week. Who is she? William clenched his jaw. No one. William, I demand an answer. I wasn't going to back down this time, lady or not. Obviously she knows you, because she's a stranger to me. She thinks she's my wife, William said evenly. Your wife? Yes. I felt faint. You have to understand, Jane, I thought you weren't coming. I thought you changed your mind, he said quickly. So you married someone else? I managed to sound calm, but my mind was shouting. William was already married? Married? He tried to put his arm around my waist, but I pulled away with a jerk. It doesn't change anything. It's not a real marriage in the eyes of God and church. She's just an Indian. I'll send her away. I looked at him wordlessly. How long had he fooled me? Then why did you marry her? The land, Jane, he said urgently. I told you, when you didn't come, I thought you'd changed your mind. I get to keep all 640 acres of my claim only if I'm married. I have to give back half, 320 acres, if I'm unmarried. He took a deep breath and plunged on. Governor Stevens suggested I marry her. I shook my head, speechless. It's complicated. Anyway, she's a half-breed. Her father was white. That's why I could marry her and legally keep the land. I see. William shook his head. I had no choice. I flinched. They were the exact same words I had said to Jehu. You are the one I want, Jane, William said. I knew that he meant it. I knew without a shred of doubt that he would put the girl aside for me. I thought of his clever words wooing me, playing on my girlish desires. Had he only ever intended to marry me to get his precious land? Had he changed? Or had I never seen his true character? Papa had. Papa had known all along, and I had been too young and foolish and stubborn to listen. All those years I'd spent dreaming of William, dreaming of becoming his wife, flashed through my mind, and all I could think of was, what bad luck. She's just an Indian, he repeated. An edge had crept into his voice. Or had it always been there? She's nothing to me. I thought of Suis and shook my head. Jehu was right. I did have a choice. She may be an Indian, I said quietly. My throat was so tight I could barely speak, but she's still your wife. So now there's a break, some time passes. My dear girl, I'm so sorry, Mr. Swan said. I sat at the sawbuck table in Mr. Russell's cabin with my face in my hands. My cheeks were wet, my eyes puffy. I had been crying all morning. Poor Mr. Russell had been so discomforted by my tears that he had taken one look at me, weeping in Mr. Swan's arms, and fled the cabin as if being chased by a pack of wild dogs. William and his wife had left too. My future, no, my life had left. What am I to do? I asked. I don't even know if I can survive another voyage like the one it took me to get here. Mr. Swan sat opposite me and earnestly said, You could stay. Stay here in the middle of the wilderness? Yes, Jane, stay. The word hung on the air, hummed in the still of the cabin. But there's nothing here for me. Mr. Swan's face fell. I can't, Mr. Swan. You must understand. I don't belong here. I'm a lady. A gleam entered Mr. Swan's eye. A lady who has an oyster business? Yes, but... A lady who dives into a raging river for an old man's canoe? But... A lady who carves up a whale? There are rules, I said, exasperated. Jane, there are no rules here, and you are a lady, the finest in all of Shoalwater Bay. What kind of future would I have here? You, of all people, must understand. Your wife and children back in Boston... My voice trailed off. But there was no mistaking my point. His own wife hadn't wanted to come to the wilderness. Mr. Swan was silent, and I knew I'd hurt his feelings. Papa said there are plenty of eligible young men in Philadelphia, I said in a small voice, realizing at once how very much I missed the sound of Papa's laughter. And besides, I miss him. I miss Philadelphia. I miss Miss Parker and her cherry pie. I miss everything. I want to go home. Mr. Swan nodded. Well, we'll miss you, my dear. You are like a daughter to me, he said heavily, his eyes watery. I'm sorry, Mr. Swan, but really, this is the most sensible decision. I must go. The Hetty was due back in Shoalwater Bay in 2 weeks' time, and I would be on her. Some more time passed. It seemed no coincidence that the day of my departure dawned fair and bright. A sweet September breeze was blowing across the water, much like the day we'd first sailed into Shoalwater Bay. The sun bounced off the smooth surface, and everything looked so beautiful and green that I almost believed that Shoalwater Bay was luring me to stay, but it was too late. I was packed and ready to go. I looked like a respectable young lady for the first time in months in the new blue dress I had stitched. Very well then, my dear, Mr. Swan said sadly. Handsome Jim had refused to see me off. Boston Jane leave? He said dully. I must. There's nothing to keep me here now that I'm not marrying William. I'm going back to Philadelphia and my friends and family are there. No, Boston Jane not leave. But, his eyes were dark. We your friends, Boston Jane, he said. He stared at me angrily for a moment and then stormed off into the woods. Mr. Swan and Mr. Russell carried my trunk down to the beach where I would wait for the Hetty. Mr. Russell spat loudly. Truly, I was going to miss dodging his tobacco. There you go, Jane, Mr. Swan said, trying to put on a cheery face as he put down his end of the trunk with a small wheeze. Brandywine was darting around the beach, chasing gulls, and Sooty sat on the trunk, like a queen on her throne. She didn't quite understand that I was leaving for good. She thought I was moving for the winter, the way her family left Shoalwater Bay in the winter. I didn't try to correct her. Mr. Russell took off his cap, scratching his head. Would the man ever be rid of fleas? Good luck, gal, Mr. Russell said. He seemed on the verge of saying something else, but then simply shook his head and turned and walked over the dunes. Mr. Swan was trying to be jovial, but it was clear that he was still quite unhappy with my decision. Now you will be sure to keep in touch. We have business, you and I, he said, his throat catching. Yes, of course, I said stiffly. He held out a bag, a small present for your leave-taking. There is never anything decent aboard a ship, to eat aboard a ship. Small clusters of strange-looking fruit attached to branches rested inside the cloth. They're crab apples, quite tart, but I've acquired a taste for them, he said with a forced smile. Perhaps you can make one of your famous pies. Thank you, I said. The food was certainly terrible on the voyage here. He swallowed hard. You'll forgive me if I don't see you off. I'm not very good at farewells, he said, and turned and strode away. The previous day, Father Joseph had stopped by as I was packing, a packet of letters in his hand. For the bishop, he explained. I nodded and took the packet. He regarded me silently. I remembered the outbound voyage on the Lady Luck and everything that had happened since. Father Joseph was woven up in all my memories. I'll miss you, Father, I said, hugging him impulsively. Father Joseph swallowed, his eyebrows knitted in concern. God watch over you, ma chérie, he said. The Hetty sailed into the bay, its white sails fluttering. A sudden wind rose and blew over me, gentle as a kiss, the air smelling sweetly of salt and the sea. Jehu. I wondered if he still hated me halfway to China. Brandywine nuzzled his cold nose expectantly in my hand. I have no food, Brandywine, I said, but I shall miss you. Sudi was playing in a shallow tide pool, splashing about. I slipped off my new boots and joined her. The water was cool, the sand hard beneath my feet. She made a face in the water. Pretty Sudi, she declared. I studied my reflection in the water, the sunburned face, the round cheeks, the nose dotted with freckles, hair unabound and fluttering wildly in the wind. The girl looking back at me bore no resemblance to the thin, pale, quiet, tidy, proper creature that had departed Philadelphia so many months ago. The Hetty dropped anchor, and a rowboat was being lowered. I put on my boots, picked up my case, and stood patiently on the sand. I looked at the sack in my hand and pulled out one of the odd little crab apples. And the strangest thing happened. Will you believe it? It all came rushing back. Being 11 years old and laughing with Jebediah Parker, the sun shining down as if it wouldn't shine forever, the feel of a rotten apple heavy in my hand, how at that moment the future seemed full of possibility, the whole world stretched out like Mrs. Parker's cherry pie just waiting for me to take a bite, how I was the luckiest girl in the world. So the apple is like triggering all those memories. Jane! I looked up. Jehu was waving to me from the rowboat, and he was smiling. I stood on the beach, my heart thudding in my chest. My life felt as tangled and messy as my red hair. How had I gotten to this sorry state? I had been such a happy girl. Had my life truly been determined by the unlucky flight of a rotten apple? Certainly not. I was Miss Jane Peck of Philadelphia. I was also Boston Jane of Shoalwater Bay. By any name, I had a choice. I took a deep breath and smiled at Jehu. Papa always said you make your own luck, and maybe you do. The end. So that's how it ends. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Really quick, I'm going to share with you, the author's name is Jennifer L. Holm. She's written several books, so this is a trilogy. The second one is, I think, called The Wilderness, and the last one's called The Claim. So if you did like it, there were some things that were true. She did see Mr. Swan's journal and got a lot of names. So Chief Toke, Suis, Mr. Russell, Father Joseph, Champ, McCarty, Dolly, Jehu, and William were all real names of people that lived in Shoalwater Bay, but she took their names and then made a fake story. The Chinook were real, they lived there, and she talked about some of their traditions. And there was really a book. She calls it The Young Lady Confidant. The real book was called The Young Lady's Friend. So there really was a book for women telling them how to act, which I always think is interesting. So hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm going to read, the book includes the first chapter of the second book. So I'm going to do a video for that for anybody that wants. There is something surprising that happens in that first chapter if you wanted to read it. So I'll do a separate video, and that'll be optional to watch that video. You don't have to watch it. So I hope you enjoyed Boston Jane. Ta-da!